Basically, like some of the like that's like the long way around. But basically, I'll cut to the chase, mate. It's my style. Basically, Monty alluded to the fact that you were somehow involved with some things that I wouldn't even use the word controversial because it's such a whack label. I would just say things that are like often like massive conversation starters in League of Legends. So an obvious example would be like the inter-regional movement policy thing, which was basically that whole thing of like before it was just if you had the green card, it was like you could come to America and you could eventually claim you were like an NA resident, as obviously people like Svenskeren and Santorin. You'll know a bunch of the names if you've been following League for enough time. Bjergsen, obviously. Basically, he implied you were involved with this. Like, first and foremost, how much were you actually involved with it? Because obviously, like, it's like if someone says, like, I was a designer and I worked on Yasuo. It's like, whoa, did you actually invent it or just tweak it? Like, we need to know that sort of like distinction. Know how mad people would want to get at you. Was this like your idea? What were you doing with it?
It was actually. I literally wrote the rule, and I'm the one who, when I came to Riot, it was one of my first priorities because I had come from the Starcraft community. And I had seen in the Starcraft community what had happened when you had absolutely no guidelines around this. And Starcraft was my first esports love, and I didn't want to see that happen to League of Legends. So, I did join as a coordinator, so it's not like I unilaterally put the rule in place, that I didn't have to run through approval chains because that's not how business works. But yeah, I was the one who said, hey, I think we should do this. I'll do all the work, consult the lawyers, write the rules, etc. So I did that, and then it was updated. I think maybe it was in 2015, and I did the update as well. But then after that, I moved to the events team, so I didn't really touch the rule. And one thing that's important to note is that the instantiation of the policy in different regions is done by individual regions, right? So China, within the global framework, they figure out, how do we want, what does permanent residency mean in China? But as far as providing the global framework, that's what I do.
By the way, two things. One thing, very briefly, we won't say the reason why, but there's a reason why China might want their own reasons to do that. The other thing to say would be this, just to very briefly explain, the reason why his allusion to StarCraft 2 is very relevant is because in StarCraft 2, instead of LCS, you had a thing called WCS, which was like their version of trying to build what LCS became. And the main problem was this, when they ran it initially, before it was properly regionalized, like every StarCraft 2 tournament, the best Korean players just came to any tournament they wanted and could win any event in theory. So what they had to do instead was, because they felt like the best Koreans will just overwhelm all the Western regions, essentially, that was the main regions that they were worried about, they initially made it where it essentially skipped over. It didn't have a rule like Derek made here for LCS. Instead, what happened was they just skipped straight to the idea that you had to declare the region, but you then also had to actually have the like actual living papers to work in that region. So famously, an example would be actually someone who became a coach of T1 not that long ago, Polt, was playing in America, even though he was Korean, absolutely Korean, but he just declared his region as America. I think he was at school at the time, so he had like whatever the visa you would need to be able to go to university there. And so he was a rare example of a Korean. So I think Jaedong was as well. There was a couple of them. They could actually play in, like, for example, the equivalent of what would be LCS. So like that's quite relevant because obviously in that case, Blizzard's only real option was to just go with the legal route of like, look, if you can legally work here, we sort of have to let you play. But obviously that's not going to apply to a guy who's coming for the weekend. So what was the thinking of doing it in the way you did with LCS then? Because obviously it started out actually as sort of a compromise. Like some people got like to immediately be a resident, and then other people, they had to do the sort of like 8 out of 9 splits, and then we've seen it evolve over time. So what was the actual thinking of what you were trying to do differently in League?
Yeah, so the original thinking was obviously there are some players who have already made a genuine commitment to living in a different region, and you don't want to screw those people over, right? So you want to have some sort of grandfathering clause to make sure that they're reasonably accommodated. Then I think there's also the recognition that it's not so much of a legal status that we're looking for when we think of a player as North American. It's more of an identity and affiliation thing, right? So someone like Impact, who made a genuine commitment to being in the region, and I think everyone thought of as an NA player, we wanted both him to get grandfathered and future impacts to be possible. Hence the rule that's, as a proportion of time, spent playing League of Legends, we want you to spend some proportion of that time playing in NA, right? So I don't know what the current philosophy is on, the interregional movement policy because I'm not there anymore. But that was the original thinking, that it wasn't so much that we want someone to have like a passport that says I'm a United States citizen. We wanted someone who fans could identify and resonate with as, hey, yeah, this is a player who actually is a North American in spirit.
I think this policy, for me, because I was casting in Korea at the time, it was welcome on my end as well, because part of the problem that we were facing was the immense drain of Korean talent into other regions, which especially China, North America, and it was very difficult to retain star players in Korea at the time. And while it limited the amount of star players that were going to leave, just because you couldn't create like all Korean rosters in other regions without a serious commitment to doing so, like you say. And also, as much as I also enjoyed Starcraft and the kind of Korean scene around that, because it allowed people to kind of see all of the best players competing against each other. As soon as Thorin alluded to, the WCS came up, which was a new system that kind of globalized Starcraft, where before it was just kind of like watching GSL or a localized Korean tournament, and you had to go to Korea to really compete at the top level rather than having it in Europe or North America. It made a lot of sense. And this policy has gotten popular enough that now we're actually looking at significant pushback against the discussions of its removal, particularly in North America. So I think the fans have really kind of latched onto it and really appreciate it as a way to help develop local talent, because it forces regions, part of what's not talked about is it also forces regions to develop talent inherently, because otherwise they fall behind. Whereas without it, regions like North America might just import purely, right?
Yeah. And I think you can see the knock-on effects in their best version in Europe in particular, where they have a really robust talent development system with URLs, and it just feels like every year they have a new crop of star players. That's an example of a system that, if it weren't for a rule like this, I don't know that developed, or at least not developed on the schedule that it has. And particularly when we look at a place like, when we talk about like brain drain, like talent drain, I think that was going to become a serious issue with the rise of Chinese organizations that were extremely well funded and were already looking to snipe elite Korean talent. So I think it continues to be important to have this kind of rule.
This way, I'll give you like an example, since we talked about the Four Horsemen not that long ago. In my opinion, because the story that famously Jacob both reported was correct. Basically, like Team Liquid was one of them. There was a bunch of big teams, some Western teams, that were going to sign the Rocks Tigers players. If you hadn't have had a rule like this, spoiler, someone would have just signed the whole team. It was like the best team in the world at the time. So like someone would have just signed all 5 players and they probably would be in LCS or something. So the problem is, like, put it this way, I'll put my cards on the table. I don't personally care where people are from. So I just want to see the highest level performance in the game. So if that means all Koreans are in LCS, that's not a problem for me. But if you're a fan where it is important to you for some reason that someone is either from North America or this scenario that you don't want them to be mercenary, that's actually a better angle, I think, personally. It's that I don't want someone to just come for one year as a mercenary. I want them to come because they want to play in this region. Now, if you want to choose to play like Impact and play most of your career, then yeah, you're welcome. You've basically chosen to be part of the fabric of North American League of Legends at that point in time. Because essentially, there would have been a lot of cynical rosters, I can tell you. Just like the LMQ roster came over from China just before these rules came in, there literally were being planned all Korean lineups that would have come. Some of them tried essentially to do it through the qualification challenge system anyway, but people would have just come and made teams. Like this would have happened because this is when the money started to come into LCS anyway. So it's not even like hypothetical, it definitely would have happened.
Yes.
Yeah. I remember there was one team, I think it was called like Samsung Red. I don't know if it was the code name or the actual name. Yeah,
that was the actual name of the team.
Okay, yeah, that was on the literally it was about to join right before the rule had
and that was for those people who don't know, that was Samsung's third team in 2014. That was their practice partner team. Basically, it was like their internal development team, and Huni was on that roster. It was definitely happening, and I had heard that in Korea too, that they were fully intending to move over to the LCS and spread the Samsung dominion over to North American shores. But yeah, I think like now we can look at the policy in retrospect and say, hey, this has been really successful. I, like Thorin, just care about the highest level of competition, which is why I think that there should be. I think League of Legends has reached a point where the level of regional competition is so vast at the professional level that it's virtually impossible. I would say it's virtually impossible for anyone to watch every game in the major regions.
Oh, definitely. Even as just LPL alone is almost logistically impossible to watch, mate.
Yeah. It's gotten to the point where it is probably, I mean, you'd have to check, but the only way to watch it is in VODs, and to do so quickly by kind of skimming through and figuring out the major points in the game. If you're an expert, you can actually do that pretty quickly. You could probably cut the match time in half, and also with all the breaks in between games, if you eliminate those, it's much more efficient as an analyst just to watch VODs, because you can get through them in like 1/3 of the time.
Kris, I've just looked it up now. Just this week alone, there will be 16 best of 3s in LPL.
Oh my God.
That's one region. And LCK is best of 3 as well.
So that's 32 to 48 games. There should be 5 days of LCK a week, so that's 10 best of 3s. So yeah, I mean, even those 2 regions, it becomes super crazy to watch all the games. And even if you were to do it quickly, you would say generously you're looking at probably a schedule that would be 50 hours of VOD watching. And that's skimming.
This is the way I always used to say it. My joke was this. Obviously, I want every region to have like best of 3 or best of 2 and be a better format and be better competitively. But my joke is I'm actually glad they didn't do it to LEC and LCS, because otherwise Kelsey Morza and Emily Rand would be dead.
Yeah.
It would just be dead.
Well, they did.
They would have had no sleep.
They did do it, yeah.
No,
they were like, oh, we got to walk that shit back real quick.
Want to see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, be a pleb and don't.